Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the year 1350, and more specifically, we're stepping into the shoes of someone history almost never talks about. A peasant girl, not a queen, not a duchess, not a saint with a feast day and a golden halo in a manuscript, just a girl, born into mud and bread and work, living in an English village that most maps didn't bother to name. Before you settle in, go ahead and like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Now, when I say 1350, I need you to understand what that date means. It doesn't just mean the middle of the 14th century. It means you were born into a world that just ended. The Black Death arrived in England in the summer of 1348, and by the time it burned through the population in 1349, somewhere between 40 and 60% of the people in your country were dead. Some villages lost half their residents. Others lost nearly everyone. The numbers are staggering, but numbers don't capture what it actually felt like to be alive in that aftermath. Imagine being a child, maybe 5 or 6 years old, and the world you knew simply stopped working. Your neighbours disappeared. Entire families vanished within a week. Fields that were always busy sat empty. Houses stood with their doors open, and nobody inside. The smell lingered. The silence was worse. That's the England you're growing up in. Not the England of knights and tournaments and courtly love poems. The England of absence. The England that survived something it couldn't explain, and now had to figure out how to keep going with half the hands it used to have. So let's start at the very beginning. You are born, and already the odds are not in your favour. Infant mortality in the 14th century was brutal. Roughly 1 in 3 children didn't survive past their first year, and some estimates push that even higher. You arrived into a one-room house made of wattle and daub, which is a fancy way of saying sticks, mud, and optimism. The walls were a lattice of woven branches packed with a mixture of clay, straw, and animal dung, then left to dry into something that mostly kept the weather out. Mostly, the roof was thatch, thick bundles of straw or reeds layered to shed rain, though after a few years they started leaking, sagging, and hosting entire ecosystems of insects. There were no windows, not because your family didn't want them, but because glass was a luxury so far beyond a peasant's reach, it might as well have been made of starlight. If there was an opening in the wall at all, it was covered with a piece of oiled linen or a wooden shutter, both of which did a mediocre job of keeping out the cold and an excellent job of keeping out the light. Inside, the house was one room. That's it, one room for everything. Cooking, sleeping, eating, arguing, praying, being born, being sick, and occasionally dying. A fire burned in a central hearth, and the smoke drifted upward through the thatch, because there was no chimney. This meant the air inside was permanently hazy. Your eyes burned often, and respiratory problems were just a background feature of existence. About a third of the interior was sometimes penned off for animals, because livestock was too valuable to leave outside where it could be stolen, attacked by predators, or wander off into someone else's life. So you slept near chickens, possibly a pig, and whatever else your family kept alive. The smell was something you simply stopped noticing because you had never known anything different. Your bed was straw, not a mattress stuffed with straw, just straw. On the ground, maybe with a rough woolen blanket. If your family was doing reasonably well, bedbugs, fleas, and lice were permanent, uninvited companions. Nobody talked about them because everybody had them. Your mother gave birth to you in this room, attended not by a physician, because physicians didn't come to peasant houses, but by a midwife, probably a local woman who had delivered dozens of babies and learned everything she knew from experience, and the woman who taught her before that. Midwifery in the 14th century was entirely a female world. Men, even male doctors, did not attend births. The The midwife might have rubbed oils of roses or violets onto your mother's abdomen to ease the labor, or she might have simply talked her through it, held her hand, and done the grim practical work of making sure you came out alive. If things went wrong, options were limited. Prayer was common. Herbal remedies were tried. A drink of hyssop in hot water was one suggestion found in English medical manuscripts. In desperate cases, the midwife might attempt to manually reposition the baby in the womb, a terrifying procedure performed without anesthesia, antiseptics, or any real understanding of anatomy beyond what generations of women had learned through touch and repetition. If you survived the birth, you were swaddled immediately, wrapped tightly in cloth to keep your limbs straight, and your body warm, imitating the snug environment of the womb. Then someone needed to get you baptized quickly, because infant death was so common that leaving a baby unbaptized was considered spiritually reckless. The local priest would perform the sacrament, and your soul, at least, was officially accounted for. Your mother, meanwhile, entered a period of recovery that the church called confinement. For 4 to 6 weeks after giving birth, she was expected to stay inside, away from public life, until she was ritually purified through a ceremony called churching. This wasn't just tradition. It reflected a genuine belief that childbirth made a woman's body impure, contaminated in a spiritual sense that required formal cleansing before she could re-enter the community. The ceremony took place at the parish church, where the priest sprinkled her with holy water and welcomed her back. It sounds restrictive, and it was, but many women actually valued the ritual because it gave them rare, socially sanctioned rest and a community celebration afterward. In a life defined by relentless labor, 6 weeks of enforced recovery was less punishment and more the only vacation you would ever get. Now, let's talk about your childhood, because it was short. Medieval childhood was not a protected, extended phase of life. It was a brief apprenticeship in survival, and the sooner you proved useful, the better your chances of being fed consistently. By the time you could walk steadily, probably around age 2 or 3, you were already being given small tasks. Nothing dramatic. Fetching water from the well or the stream, carrying sticks for the fire, scaring birds away from the crops by standing in the field and waving your arms and shouting, which is genuinely what children did, turning them into tiny, enthusiastic scarecrows. You weren't being punished. You weren't being exploited by modern definitions, because modern definitions didn't exist yet. You were being trained. A household in 1350 was a survival unit, and every pair of hands mattered, no matter how small. By the time you were 5 or 6, your responsibilities had grown considerably. You were feeding the chickens, collecting eggs, helping to tend the garden, watching your younger siblings if there were any, and learning, always learning, by watching your mother. Education for a peasant girl in 1350 did not involve books, parchment, or a schoolroom. Literacy was rare and expensive, reserved almost entirely for clergy, the nobility, and the occasional merchant who needed it for business. You would almost certainly never learn to read or write. Your name, if it ever needed to appear on a document, would be represented by a mark, a simple cross, or a personal symbol scratched onto parchment by someone else's hand. Your education was entirely practical. Your mother taught you everything you needed to know, and the curriculum was enormous. Cooking was your first and most critical subject. The peasant diet in 1350 was simple but not as monotonous as people assume. The foundation was bread and pottage, a thick stew of whatever vegetables and grains were, available, simmered slowly over the hearth fire for hours. Research from the University of Bristol, which chemically analysed residues from medieval cooking pots found at the village of West Cotton in Northamptonshire, confirmed that peasant stews typically contained beef, mutton, cabbage, and leek. Dairy products were also important, particularly a soft, fresh cheese, sometimes called green cheese, which was a staple of the peasant table. Barley, oats, rye, and peas formed the backbone of most meals. Bread was baked from coarse grain, often dark and dense. Nothing like the light loaves you might picture. Ale was the universal drink, consumed by everyone, including children, because water was frequently unsafe. Brewing ale was actually one of the most important things a woman could do, and we'll come back to that. Your mother taught you to manage the fire, which was not a simple task. The hearth was the center of the household, and keeping it burning at the right temperature for cooking required constant attention. Too hot, and your pottage burned. Too low, and nothing cooked. Wood and peat had to be gathered, dried, and stored. Cooking pots were made of clay or occasionally iron, and they were precious. Breaking one was not an inconvenience. It was a minor disaster. You learned to handle them carefully, to scrub them clean with sand and water, and to treat them as the valuable tools they were. Your family probably named the good pot. Alongside cooking, you learned spinning. This was arguably the most universal female skill in medieval England, so deeply associated with women that the word spinster literally meant a female spinner before it ever meant an unmarried woman. England's primary industry in the 14th century was wool, and the production of woolen cloth was enormously labour-intensive. Raw wool had to be cleaned, combed, carded, and then spun into thread using a distaff and spindle, a portable tool that allowed you to spin while doing almost anything else. Women spun while watching children, while walking, while talking, while waiting. It was the original multitasking. The thread you produced was then woven into cloth for clothing, blankets, and trade. Spinning paid poorly, but it paid. And for many peasant women it was the most accessible way to earn supplementary income. The work was sedentary enough that elderly women could do it, and young girls were expected to learn as soon as their fingers were nimble enough to manage the spindle. You probably started practicing around age 7 or 8, badly at first, producing uneven, lumpy thread that your mother sighed at and used anyway. You also learned to manage the dairy and the poultry because these were considered women's domains, feeding the hens, collecting eggs, milking the cow or goat. If your family had one, making butter and cheese. These were your responsibilities. They sound quaint listed like that, but each one was physically demanding and time-sensitive. Milk spoiled quickly. Butter required hours of churning. Cheese making involved heating, curdling, pressing, and storing, all without refrigeration, all dependent on getting the process right or losing the product entirely. A girl who could manage a dairy efficiently was valuable. A girl who couldn't was a problem. Then there was the garden. Most peasant households maintained a small plot near the house where they grew vegetables, herbs, and sometimes fruit. Cabbages, onions, leeks, beans, peas, garlic, and parsley were common. Herbs served double duty as both flavouring and medicine. You learned which plants eased a headache, which ones settled a stomach, which ones could be applied to a wound. This wasn't formal herbal medicine. It was generational knowledge passed from mother to daughter, grandmother to granddaughter, neighbour to neighbour. Lavender for calm, sage for sore throats, rose for skin complaints, mint for digestion. You memorized these the way modern children memorize phone numbers, through repetition and necessity. Let's talk about the village itself, because your world in 1350 was very small. Most peasant girls never travelled more than a few miles from the place they were born. Your village was a cluster of houses, maybe 20 or 30, surrounded by open fields divided into long strips assigned to different families. A church stood at the centre, or close to it, because the church was the heart of everything. It was where you were baptized, where you attended Mass every Sunday, where you confessed your sins, where you would eventually be married, and where you would one day be buried. The parish priest was one of the most important people in your life, not because he was especially wise or holy, though some were, but because the church controlled the rhythm of your entire existence. Feast days, fast days, holy days, planting days, and harvest days were all marked by the church calendar. You attended Mass regularly. though understanding what was happening was another matter entirely. Services were conducted in Latin, a language you did not speak, read, or comprehend. You stood or knelt in the nave, listened to words that washed over you like music without meaning, and participated in the rituals, because that was what everyone did and because failing to attend could get you reported to the church courts. Religion for a peasant girl in 1350 was not intellectual. It was visceral, woven into every part of daily life. You prayed when you woke up. You prayed before meals. You prayed when you were sick, when the crops failed, when lightning struck too close, when a child was born, when someone died. Saints were not abstract theological concepts. They were allies, protectors, specialists you called on for specific problems. Saint Margaret was invoked during childbirth. The Virgin Mary was appealed to for almost everything. Local saints, whose relics might rest in a nearby monastery or church, were approached with personal, almost, conversational familiarity. You didn't just believe in God. You lived inside a world where the divine was as real and present as the mud under your feet, and just as inescapable. Now, here is where 1350 gets interesting, because the Black Death didn't just kill people, it rearranged the entire social order. And for peasant girls and women, some of those changes were unexpectedly significant. Before the plague, England was overpopulated relative to its resources. Land was scarce, wages were low, and lords held enormous power over the peasants who worked their estates. Villeins, or unfree peasants, were legally tied to the land. They couldn't leave the manor without permission. They couldn't marry without their lord's approval. They owed labour services, rents, and dues that consumed most of what they produced. Life was hard, and options were few. Then the plague killed between 40 and 60% of the population. And suddenly, the math changed. There were not enough workers to farm the fields, tend the livestock, harvest the crops, or maintain the estates. Labour became scarce, and scarce labour became valuable. Wages rose sharply. In England, pay for agricultural workers increased by 20 to 40% in the decade following the plague. At Farnham All Saints in Suffolk, reapers who had been paid 3 pence per acre before the plague were suddenly commanding 5 pence, a 67% increase. Lords who had once dictated terms to their peasants now found themselves competing for workers who could simply walk away to a better offer somewhere else. The English government, alarmed by this shift, passed the Statute of Labourers in 1351, which attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and make it a criminal offence for workers to demand higher pay or for employers to offer it. The statute also mandated that all able-bodied men and women under 60 who did not have other means of support must work when required. At the old rates, women were explicitly included in this legislation, which tells you something important. Women were working. They were visible in the labour market. They were earning wages, and the government was worried enough about their bargaining power to try to legislate it away. For peasant women and girls, the post-plague world cracked open doors that had been sealed shut. With fewer hands available, women took on work that had previously been done exclusively by men. They reaped, they ploughed, they threshed, they took over vacant holdings. Widows inherited land and managed estates. The strict division of labour that had kept women in the dairy and the garden, while men worked the fields, blurred significantly. Records from manorial courts show women appearing more frequently, not as passive subjects, but as active participants in economic life, renting land, paying fines, conducting transactions. This didn't mean equality, not remotely. The system was still deeply patriarchal, and the church still taught. Explicitly included in this legislation, which tells you something important. Women were working. They were visible in the labour market. They were earning wages, and the government was worried enough about their bargaining power to try to legislate it away. For peasant women and girls, the post-plague world cracked open doors that had been sealed shut. With fewer hands available, women took on work that had previously been done exclusively by men. They reaped, they ploughed, they threshed, they took over vacant holdings. Widows inherited land and managed estates. The strict division of labour that had kept women in the dairy and the garden, while men worked the fields, blurred significantly. Records from manorial courts show women appearing more frequently, not as passive subjects, but as active participants in economic life, renting land, paying fines, conducting transactions. This didn't mean equality, not remotely. The system was still deeply patriarchal, and the church still taught that women were subordinate to men, spiritually weaker, morally suspect, and in need of constant supervision. But the practical reality on the ground in 1350 was that a peasant girl growing up in post-plague England had opportunities her grandmother could not have imagined. If you were strong, capable, and willing to work, people needed you. And being needed was, in the medieval world, the closest thing to power a peasant girl could get. One of the most fascinating examples of female economic activity in 14th century England was ale brewing. Before the plague, and for a considerable time afterward, women brewed and sold most of the ale consumed in England. This was not a hobby, it was a commercial enterprise. Ale was the staple drink of the medieval world, consumed at every meal by every member of the household, including children. Water was often contaminated, and ale, produced through a brewing process that involved boiling, was significantly safer to drink. Every village needed a steady supply, and the women who provided it, known as alewives or brewsters, were essential figures in the local economy. Brewing required skill and equipment. You needed a large vessel for mashing the grain, fuel to heat water, malt prepared from barley or oats, and knowledge of the fermentation process, which was understood practically even if the science behind it remained a mystery. An alewife typically brewed in her own home, using the same hearth that cooked the family's meals. When a fresh batch was ready for sale, she hung a broom or a bush above her front door, a signal to the village that ale was available. This was medieval advertising, simple and effective. The ale trade was regulated. Local officials, called ale tasters, inspected the product for quality and checked that prices were fair. Brewsters who sold bad ale or overcharged were fined, and these fines appear regularly in manorial court records, giving historians a remarkably detailed picture of who was brewing, how often, and where. In most villages, the majority of brewers named in these records were women. A successful alewife like Denise Marley, who died in 1401, brewed commercially for more than 20 years, managing a profitable business and investing heavily in equipment and supplies. Her example, while exceptional, illustrates what was possible. After 1350, however, the brewing trade began to shift. Men started entering the industry, drawn by its profitability in a post-plague economy, where demand remained high but producers were fewer. Over time, the transition from ale to hopped beer, which required more expensive equipment and larger-scale production, gradually pushed women out. By the late 1400s, brewing was increasingly a male-dominated industry. But in your lifetime, in 1350, if you were a peasant girl watching your mother or a neighbour brew ale for the village, you were watching a woman run a business, manage customers, handle money, and hold a position of genuine importance in the community. That image doesn't match the helpless medieval peasant woman of popular imagination, but it is far closer to the truth.